My name is Peter Young, and I'm head of programs at Societe de Chimie Industrielle, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our first webcast in 2022. We were hoping to restart in-person events, but we've had to delay it at least through the end of March for the reasons we all know. But I'm very pleased to have a wonderful speaker on a very important topic to go through a fireside chat with all of you today. Before I start, I just want to remind you there are two events that are coming up. One in February, which is going to feature the editors-in-chief of Chemical Week and ICIS Chemical Business and myself on a panel that we do every year now for many years on the industry outlook, and that's jointly with Ray Simix. And normally we fill the ballroom at the Yale Club with people, but this year we're just going to have to fill the virtual ballroom. And then in March we have an interesting one, which is the CEO of the Science History Institute will give a speech along with some of his staff on the history of vaccines and where things are headed and the impact that vaccines are having on the global healthcare industry. So just wanted to tell you about those two upcoming events. There'll also be one in April that we're working on the paints and coatings industry and what the innovations are and where the trends are there. And we're putting a panel together for that. So we hope you can join us for as many of these that interest you. And so with that, let me start by saying I'm very, very pleased to have Steve Cutler talk. He's the CEO of one of the largest and most successful CROs. We like to have events that bridge the life sciences and also the chemical industry. And anyone who's involved at all in the life science industry knows how important the CRO industry is. It is a huge industry that's growing 7% per year and has a very, very important role in terms of the development and approval and commercialization of new drugs, et cetera. So important topic, and obviously important relative to all the things we're all going through, because companies like ICON have a very important role in terms of getting drugs through and approved to deal with so many of the difficult therapeutic areas and challenges. So just a little bit about Steve Cutler. He is the CEO of ICON. He's been the CEO since March 1st of 2017. And he joined in 2011, initially as a group president of clinical research services, which of course is a very important part of ICON, and then became the chief operating officer in January of 2018. But he's had 25 years of experience in the pharmaceutical and CRO industries. He was the chief executive officer of Kendall. Prior to that, he had 14 years with Quintiles. And prior to that, he was a senior executive at Sandoz, now Novartis, in Australia and Europe. So he has an extraordinary career with some very, very well-known companies, but certainly a very extensive career in the CRO industry. And he is originally from Australia, which I think you can tell from his accent. And he's also very tall, which you can't tell because this is a virtual event, but you wouldn't want to pick on Steve Cutler in a dark alley because you would not win. Is that correct, Steve?
I hope I wouldn't come to that, Peter.
So, well, we have a number of questions we want to go, but I also like to start out a little bit about exploring the personal history of the person I'm interviewing. And you're from Australia, you grew up there. Tell us a little bit about your early years and how your upbringing influenced your career choices. And of course, probably the highlight of your upbringing was participating in the national Australia rugby team. By the way, I never pick a fight with anybody who plays rugby because you almost certainly lose. And I have a lot of roommates from Harvard Business School who were on the rugby team, and they usually came back and they looked like they had been to the emergency room because they'd been bashed and battered and so forth. But the first thing they would say is, I had such a great time. So Steve, tell me a little about your upbringing and maybe some of the influences from that.
Sure. Thanks, Peter, and thank you for the welcome, and nice to be able to talk a little bit about background and also about the CRO industry. It's had a major impact on the pandemic and the development of the vaccine. So perhaps we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through. But in terms of my background, as you can tell now by my accent, I am Australian by birth. I've lived in the United States now for almost 20 years. From 2003, working in the industry. But I grew up in Sydney, in Australia. My father was a surgeon. He grew up during the Depression, and that as I think about it, that had a pretty big impact. He had obviously a big impact. You're a product of your environment, and you're a product of your parents. And my father was as I say, a child in the Depression. He lost his father very early on in a car accident with one of the more the lights here tend to go off. We're so concerned about costs in the CRO industry. The lights go off if you don't move in your office too long, Peter. But he grew up in the Depression. His father was killed in an early car accident, and when he was literally in 5 or 6, and so he grew up in a pretty tough upbringing there. He did economics when he finished school, and then went to the war and joined the Air Force. And came back from the war and studied medicine, became a surgeon in Sydney. So didn't qualify till well into his 30s as a doctor. Went to the UK and did his fellowship and all that. Anyway, I mean, that really sort of set the tone for us as a family. My father was a fairly utilitarian, pragmatic sort of person, a very successful Sydney surgeon in the end, but grew up, he had a tough time growing up, and that always translated to his children. He had 3 of them. I'm the eldest, and that's probably come through a little bit in my personality as well, as I work within a CRO where we're always very cost conscious and we need to utilize resources effectively and efficiently. And so it's I guess as I look at my background there, that's been important. The other thing is, you mentioned my rugby career. Rugby's a game that perhaps folks on the call will know, particularly as a club sport, as a university club sport in the United States. It's played obviously extensively in Britain and Europe, and obviously in Australia, South Africa. And that's where I played. I was lucky enough to play for the Wallabies. That's the Australian national team for about 10 years or so in the 80s, I guess. And we had a great time. As you say, it's a sport where there are no helmets or pads or those sorts of things. You have to you have to pass the ball backwards. You can't throw it forwards, and it's a sport that has a great mateship sort of. You have a great respect for your opposition. You go at each other pretty hard during the match, and you play by the rules, but you have great respect for each other as you finish the game, and as you celebrate afterwards, whether you lose or whether you win. You go and have a beer afterwards and enjoy each other's company, not just your teammates, but the opposition as well. There's a culture in rugby, I think, of mateship and of teamwork, I think, which has probably had some influence in my career as well. But it certainly, it was a great 10 years or so as I played on the national team. Obviously, I came up and you work your way up through representative teams. But I was able to tour countries. I'd spent way too much time in New Zealand playing against the All Blacks. People will know them as probably the best team in the world, certainly the best team in the world over the last 25 years or so. But then we played in Britain. I played over here in Ireland a number of times, France. So, you got to see the world. I was an amateur. We weren't paid. So you learned again to work with your teammates. I was studying at the time, doing my Ph.D. in Sydney, at Sydney University in the science field and endocrinology. And so, background of education, working in a team environment in rugby, and as I say, your family influences all go into sort of mold you, I guess, as an individual and as a person who has a certain outlook on life as you move up the management ranks.
So Steve, does that mean that even today, when you beat your competitor for a project, you take them out for a beer afterwards?
Not so much, not so much, but it's certainly my competitive streak I think is pretty well established. Peter, we like to win here at Icon, and winning's important for us, whether it be winning in terms of getting our customers' projects through to the finish line on time and on budget, or whether it be winning in a business development sense. It's a very competitive industry, as you can appreciate, as is yours, as is most industries these days. But that sort of competitive sport angle, I think, has certainly helped me as I've developed.
Steve, in terms of your career, for a while you were more in traditional pharma, and then you moved into the CRO world. What attracted you to the industry, and sort of how did that transition happen?
Yeah, I mean, as I think I mentioned, I grew up as a science graduate. I did a PhD in Sydney for 5 years while I was playing rugby. And as I then more or less fell into the pharmaceutical industry in Sydney and working in a project management type environment, realized that not having a medical degree, the pharmaceutical industry, particularly, this is like 30 years ago, even a little longer. I think you were kind to me saying I had 25 years of experience, but it's actually a little longer than that, as you can tell by my grey hair. But in the pharma industry back in those days, I think it's less so now, but back in those days, you needed to be a medic. You needed to be a medically qualified to really move up the ranks, certainly in the R&D space. And so as I spent 8 or 9 years with Sandoz, enjoyed it very much, but I realized that I was probably never going to make a head of R&D or a head of development as a PhD, and that was sort of the fact back in those days. It may be a little different now, but so the CRO industry, which was really just sort of developing at that time, really started in the early '80s, but it was developing in the later '80s and into the '90s. It was really starting to move along. So I looked at that industry and thought, there's an opportunity for me in that sort of industry, and it was proven to be a very good career move, because I've moved around the world. I've spent time obviously in Australia, both in pharma and CRO. I spent time in South Africa, a very interesting time when Nelson Mandela had just been released. It was sort of 96, 97, 98, those sort of years. An interesting time with truth and reconciliation commissions going on. So we spent time there, and then I spent more time in the UK, in the CRO industry, and I'd spent some time there with Sandoz as well. So I've been able to move around the world, get some experience in different cultures and different geographies, and different ways of doing things, and that's helped me as well as I've learned to manage and run a global organization. One of the key characteristics of our business is we are very much a global business. You work with different regions, different countries, different cultures, different languages, and very different people in a way that has to be, consistently and managed in a standardized manner as you run a clinical trial. And so it's been helpful, I think, to be able to be exposed to those different cultures and, as I say, people as I've moved along in my career.
Yeah. Well, let's step back and think about the industry for a moment. Almost every industry goes through some change, but I do think that the CRO, CDMO industry over the last 30 or so years has really changed dramatically, in terms of almost everything, pretty much everything, whether it's a size or the technologies, the customer needs. They've changed very, very dramatically. Could you point to maybe, the 3 or 4 things that you think were the most dramatic changes over the last 20, 30 years, and not only in terms of the companies, but also their relationships with the pharma and biotech companies?
Yeah, when you look at our industry, it's really only 40 years old or so. Early '80s was the establishment of the first sort of CROs. These are organizations that and that helped pharmaceutical companies. And at that point, it was really a matter of extra arms and legs, extra people to do the work that the pharmaceutical companies themselves were doing. It's evolved, really through the years to being, a much more strategic sort of use of resource, and a much more cerebral use of resource, I think, going forward. And the partnership angle I think has really burgeoned and increased and developed as we've developed as an industry. So we, at ICON, we have partnerships with a number of the top pharmaceutical companies. Well, that's really our true partnerships. Our partners recognize that we can do things that they can't do. And we do things that sometimes, in many areas, we do things better than what they would do. Now, in our case, the pharma companies often have a development function or a clinical research, so they overlap us in many ways. But there are increasingly, particularly in the biotech space, companies don't have that function.
Yeah.
And so they do rely on CROs. And so we do have to be have a very close knit partnership and relationship with those sponsors to move their drugs and devices through the pipeline. So in terms of what's changed, it's really we've become a much more strategic alliance partner, I think, than we were, say, 20 or 30 years ago in the industry, when the industry started, where we were it was really about capacity and resources. We're much more, I think, involved in providing advice, in providing consulting. We use the technology, we integrate the technology, and that's one of the big changes, I think, that's happened in our industry. The availability of technology, whether it be electronic data capture, which has been in place now for a number of years now, to electronic health records, which are available now to record data, normal data, but then can be used to transfer that data into a clinical trials database. So the opportunity to use those sorts of databases and those sorts of areas to be more efficient in doing clinical trials is something that's really moved forward. The technology itself is, we're in an unprecedented era with technology, with these wearables and these iPhones that we have, and the ability to collect data is really unprecedented. And that's really one of the big changes, I think, that's happening in our industry going forward. The ability to collect that data and process that data in a much more effective and efficient manner than we've done in the past.
Yeah, and from my view, looking back, I mean, I first started in venture capital with the Whitney family, and we invested in one of the first biotech companies, Genetics Institute, and that wasn't that long ago. That was in the late 70s, early 80s. And actually, the interesting thing is, until that point, a lot of these drug companies, they weren't biotechs, and the drug companies did a lot of the stuff themselves, but then they started to outsource or move their manufacturing and clinical trials out. But I guess the real boom happened when the biotechs really became viable, because they didn't necessarily have their own internal, people in manufacturing. So there, it wasn't a choice of, do I do it in-house or do I use an outside like a Pfizer? But there, they really don't have the scale and the capabilities, right?
That's right. That's absolutely right. And when you look at where the big drugs and where a lot of the the innovation is coming from in the pharmaceutical industry, it really is from the biotech industry. Something like 2/3 of the new drugs that have got to market in the last 5 or 10 years have come from biotech, have come from very small companies who have a great idea or some great technology and have been able to get those drugs and those devices through to the market. And that's really largely been because they've had the ability to outsource that development to companies like ICON, and to our industry. Big pharma are still major players, obviously, but they've become more marketing and regulatory machines. The R&D, in many cases now, is really coming from the smaller, agile, adaptive, biotech companies. They've been extremely well funded, as you'll know, over the last,
Right.
5 years ago. We've seen unprecedented levels of capital available to these, and they have real ambition to move these drugs and devices through to the market. They're not just doing a proof of concept and then partnering up with a large pharma anymore. They are wanting to to get to market themselves. So it's a very different industry now than it was even 10, 15 years ago. It's changed quite dramatically.
Yeah, and just a great example are these COVID-19 vaccines, right? They're Pfizer and so forth. There have been all partnerships, with biotechs, and
That's right.
That's just a good example of how the system has evolved. But that's been a boon for you, right? Because it's because of that there's that's one of the reasons why there's greater demand for your services, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the vaccines, have been a huge opportunity for us. I mean, the pandemic's been a horrible, it's a very challenging thing over the last, 2 years or so. For our industry, though, we've seen some changes I'll talk about in a moment, but we were certainly very much involved in the vaccine. It's a matter of public record that the Pfizer BioNTech, we had 1,000 people working on that large scale trial, mainly in Latin America, US, and in Europe. But we were monitoring that trial using some of the technology that's now available to us on a remote basis. We had people in Japan monitoring data in Argentina, at a site in Argentina. It's really quite extraordinary how the technology's been able to develop, and the acceptance of that technology from the regulators and from the sites, and of course the patients, has been quite amazing, really, over the last just couple of years. And the pandemic was a real catalyst, if you like, to moving that technology along. We work in a fairly conservative, traditional sort of industry. Things don't happen usually very fast. The pandemic really changed that, and it's given our industry a huge opportunity to continue those changes and to make things much more efficient than perhaps they were in the past. So the vaccine developments, we're very proud of our role, not just in the Pfizer vaccine. We were involved in a number of other large vaccine trials too. It's one of our sort of core areas of competence, I would say, as an organization. But we're very proud of our role. Of course, our Pfizer, sponsor were very much involved, as well as were the sites and the patients. But that was a real highlight in what we've done at ICON over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I'm sure the pandemic created a lot of challenges for you across the board, right? In terms of trying to get clinical trials and things done for so many clients when hospitals are filled up, researchers are tied up who are supposed to work on, your clinical trial, but they're tied up, with the COVID-19. So that you're going to be very happy, I suspect, when the pandemic is past us, as we all hope will happen sometime soon, right?
Indeed. It has been a challenging time, I think, for everyone. And some industries, of course, have been hit a lot harder than we have. As I said, we had some silver linings with large vaccine trials and this adoption of technology that perhaps probably wouldn't have happened, and I think can have a long-term impact for us. But certainly a number of the trials we were running in more traditional areas, oncology, respiratory, immunology, etc., was significantly slowed down with the onset of the pandemic, and the fact that sites just weren't able to handle those patients. And so we had some challenges there, which we've worked through, particularly in 2020 and early 2021, but we've worked through those. And, our business is looking in good shape as we move into the next few years. There's a lot of things sort of converging here. The science, mRNA technology, checkpoint inhibitors, cell and gene therapy. There's really we're on the cusp of a real revolution, I think, in terms of the science and the ability to use these sorts of technologies to get drugs to market. And then on the more sort of operational technologies, if you like, the wearables, these things we have these phones we have in our pockets, the ability for those things to be able to measure all sorts of different sort of biomarkers in patients, and for our patients to interact with those things on a more decentralized basis, to record data in a more decentralized manner. So, there's a lot of things happening. As I say, the pandemic as well has made this all much more acceptable and understandable. The regulators have played their role in that, in approving trials, with this sort of technology. So, for me, there's a number of converging, positive tailwinds and influences in our business that are really helping, I think, to drive our industry forward and our market forward. You talked about a 6 or 7% growth rate. I think that's baseline. We anticipate growing at higher than that over a longer period of time, based on, as I say, some of the science, some of the wearables technology, and of course the acceptance of clinical trials and the understanding of clinical trials at a much greater level within our society now.
Yeah, that's right. By the way, I'm sure every day you say, "I'm so glad I wasn't running a cruise ship company or a Broadway theater company," right? It's hard to pivot from that when you have no customers, right? By the way, since my firm, Younger Partners, that I'm head of, we do life sciences and chemicals, and we had our annual we have an annual pharmaceutical conference, which the one in 2020, we had Peter Marks, who is the head of all vaccine he oversees all vaccine development at FDA. And that was a speech to remember, because what they were going through during this whole process of the pandemic and all this pressure was pretty extraordinary. Now, I want to switch over to, again, to stay with this big picture. So, one of the big stories over the last 20 years has been this relentless consolidation of the industry and the involvement of private equity investors. And the ongoing trend, of course, is big pharma has continued to move manufacturing and clinical trials out of their own companies and into the hands of companies like yourself. In your view, what's driving this consolidation activity? And obviously, you're participating in that with your acquisition of PRA, and yet, after all this consolidation, there's still a lot of fragmentation. So, what's your view? Taking a strategic point of view, what's been driving consolidation, and why is the industry still somewhat fragmented?
Yeah, as I said, we're only 40 years old as an industry, so we're not terribly old. There's a sort of maturation, I suppose, of our industry that's really starting here in terms of that consolidation. And the way I see it is that consolidation will likely continue, and really, if I could put it in a couple of words, that's really around scale, and it's around efficiency. Drug development needs to happen globally. You need to get patients into clinical trials, collect that data, analyze and report that data, and submit it to the regulatory authorities. So it's an area that where you have organizations that can go to Latin America, or to Asia, or to India, or to, obviously, in the United States and Europe, Central. You need to be able to collect patients and collect data, run those trials. So scale is very important for us. But having said, and so that's been a big driver of consolidation, really, over the last, let's be honest, last 20 or so years. As we get to these bigger players, and we've probably got, there's probably 5 or 6 sort of large players in the industry now. You would call real, truly global CROs. There's a number in the middle, sort of mid-sized CROs that have a little bit of a niche, and then there's 1,000 small niche players, and that they will always have their place, I believe, in the clinical development landscape. Small niche players, whether they focus on a particular country, or a particular therapeutic area, or a particular function, adaptive trials, or pediatric sort of development, or rare diseases. Obviously, there's a lot of development being done in rare diseases. So you're going to have those smaller companies, but it's the larger ones. I think it'll go a little bit like the accounting industry, Peter, where you now have the big four, the KPMGs and the EYs and the PwC. So I think in a next 3 to 5 years, we'll probably move down. There'll probably 4 or 5, very large, scaled up CROs that'll do probably 60 to 70% of the work that's done in the industry. It's a little less than that now, and there'll be I think there'll probably still be 1,000 small niche players who continue to play a role, with companies where they supplement their expertise and supplement their development. So it'll move, I think, in that direction as we mature as an industry, and I think that's really been driven by, as I said, an acceptance from our pharma sponsors and biotech sponsors that the CRO companies do much of the development work in a more effective and a more efficient way than they do, and that's taken a while. And I was part of pharma, as you know, earlier in my career, and I was we did some outsourcing, hands and legs, hands and feet sort of outsourcing, and the attitude we had within Sandoz at that time, back in the 80s and 90s, was of course that those companies can't do it better than us. We're the pharma company, we are the best at doing this. But that arrogant attitude, which I had as a member of a pharma company, I think has dissipated significantly now over the last, and that partnership angle, that strategic connections, I think have made it so that we as an industry play a much better and a much greater role, and a much more effective role in the development of drugs going forward. And I think that'll only continue, and in the form of further continued consolidation as the industry matures and moves forward.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, so your prediction is continued consolidation, but that structurally there'll still be a lot of the smaller players based on certain niches or certain countries or geographic where they have some, shall we say, competitive, angle with customers.
I think that's right. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all people, and despite the fact that most of us are data geeks and we love looking at the data, and most of us are scientists, there's a relationship angle. And people, these small CROs are usually started by people who come out of pharma or come out of other CROs. They have a particular area of expertise, a niche area of expertise. They set up, an organization, a small organization around themselves, around the principles. They often get acquired by the bigger CROs and they come together, but many of them will continue, and they'll continue to develop because they'll come out of companies that they have strong relationships with. And hence, that work will come to them and will fuel their growth, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think we'll ever be in a situation where there's not going to be a large number of small players. I think if you're sort of stuck in the middle, as Michael Porter would say, you're not quite the large global scalable CRO, and you're not really an expert in your niche with a particular relationship to a pharma sponsor. You're kind of stuck in the middle. I think those are the companies that will probably be at most risk of being acquired or going out of business in the medium to longer term. But even they would say in the short term that small company, the old argument, small CRO for a small company, I think that argument's wearing a little thin and probably isn't going to sustain in the longer term. But that's where they are at the moment, and it's been an effective sort of selling strategy up till now.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting. I've been involved over the years with many deals in the sector, right? And it's interesting because in some cases, some people say there are some disadvantages that might crop up as you get to be large. I mean, certainly, for example, in investment banking, the boutiques are doing extremely well, and in part because there are some things about the large firms that are a problem, a disadvantage, right? Conflicts of interest, all sorts of things, and so forth. Are there any things that, as you get larger, are disadvantages, I guess, in terms of the marketplace and competition?
Well, you kind of alluded to it. The disadvantage is the perception that the smaller companies get lost in the fray, lost in the mix. And I think that's certainly what the smaller CROs would say. That's again, they're selling. It's a little bit of a negative selling strategy. You'll get lost there. You won't get lost with us. Mm-hmm. I think that's sort of wearing a little thin. I think the larger organizations are getting better at running and managing and effectively building relationships with those smaller companies. At Icon, as we've merged with PRA, we have the legacy PRA phase 2, phase 3 is entirely focused in the biotech, small and mid-size area. We haven't changed that at all, and we haven't disrupted or we haven't tried to push it together. We haven't, because we recognize how important that segment is. So we bring to it not just that focus and that relationship building sort of area, but we also bring the scale, because at the end of the day, you've got to run these. I mean, the biotechs need to run these large trials, and the phase 3 trial that they're running is just as large as the phase 3 trial that the large pharma's running. And so they need to have that scale and that expertise and those resources that we have available to us. So they do need us. It's all very well to work with a smaller company that you can pick up the phone and talk to the CEO. But if they don't have the resources in Latin America or in Asia or in Central East, that there's nothing that talking to the CEO is going to help to change that. So I think there's always that argument, but I do believe that the larger companies in the industry are making good progress in that space. Certainly the growth in our business around the biotech, small and mid-size segment of the market has been substantial. And we have very good relationships. In fact, more partnerships with those companies going forward. We're essentially their only provider, or we're one of a very small number of providers. And they have strong pipelines, as I mentioned, and they have plenty of money and plenty of capital available to prosecute those pipelines.
Steve, there were a lot of headlines, when you announced that you were going to acquire PRA, and it's a big deal, a large deal, and so forth. How does the PRA acquisition changing your profile and the capabilities of Icon?
Oh, it changes it significantly. Legacy PRA and legacy Icon organizations. We were sort of number five and six on the basis of revenue in our industry. So we were both good, solid players. But we had some gaps. Certainly had some gaps geographically, and we had some gaps, functionally. And so bringing us together really, as I've said it before, gave us the scale. It gave us that global scale that we were now, with number one or number two in pretty much every clinical segment that we operate in the full service area, in our functional service, in our early phase area. Things like we have a lab, we have an imaging, we have a home health care, we have a site network. So we focus in the clinical space. We bringing those two, number five and number six together, really moved us up to kind of one or two in most of those clinical market segments. So it gave us scale that we otherwise didn't have. So we're part of the conversation now with all major sponsors when they talk about large programs, or even more importantly, large partnerships. It also brought to us, both organizations had great complementarity in terms of customer relationships and partnerships. And these are, as our industries develop, that partnership angle has been a very much a key part of the driver of our growth. Partnerships and, being one of a very small number, almost having a committed spend from those sponsors each year is a very important part of our sort of business development sort of operation. So we were able to bring on those partnerships, the technology. Certainly the legacy PRA brought to us a mobile health platform. We talk about decentralized clinical trials and where the industry is going on that front. So they brought some technology. They brought some. I mean, we were strengthened in places like Japan and China as well. So, it was a really nice complementary fit, if you like. Similar culture, similar approach, and the integration is going very well from that point of view. We've been able to really engage those customers and move our business forward in a very seamless manner up till now.
Did they have any rugby players on the senior management team, or are you going to have to train them?
I think I'm going to have to get my old rugby boots out on that one. Their CEO, the CEO of PRA is a Scotsman, or he was a Scotsman, so he knows rugby well. He didn't play a whole lot of it, but we were able to connect in terms of at least understanding the twos and fro's of a rugby match going forward.
Now, I'd like to talk again, staying with the big picture, because it's the industry. Your industry is really, from a big picture point of view, is going through a lot of changes. And as you know, there's so many industries, some of them very established, that are going through some radical structural change. I mean, two examples. One is the automotive industry, and it was kind of very stable. Now, electronic vehicles is totally rearranging the deck in terms of what skills you have to have. What do you do if you're already an established player? It allows new players to come in, like Tesla and so forth. Another good example is the whole entertainment industry. So with the advent of streaming video and new players like Netflix and the Disney Channel and Amazon, radical change in how products are delivered, but who the competitors are. So is there something similar in terms of a radical outside, not internal, but industry-wide structural change that you see happening that's going to impact the CRO, CDMO market and industry?
Yeah, as I contemplate those sorts of changes, those sort of external, significant external, I come back to, healthcare costs, particularly in the United States. And we talk about 17-18%, I think it is, of GDP now spent in healthcare. It's an extraordinary amount of money, and probably twice what's been spent on a GDP basis in other countries. I'm not sure we always get great value for it.
Well, we're ranked. I think we're ranked 27th in terms of quality, but we're ranked number one in terms of cost.
Number one in terms of the cost, and number 27.
Yeah, it's not a good ratio, right?
Not a good ratio. It's not a good ratio. And, for better or for worse, and probably for worse, drugs and the cost of drugs gets a lot of visibility in that spend. Now, drugs are, 10 to 12% of healthcare costs. So for me, I would say drugs are a very, very cost effective way of part of the healthcare system. So they do the cost benefit, if you like, of pharmaceuticals is, I think, unprecedented, and they're very cost effective. But I think, as we all know, they get a lot of focus. They get a lot of visibility because they are, the costs are relatively visible. People sort of understand that, whereas you don't know how much it costs when you go and get an MRI or some sort of service. You know how much you pay when you go to the pharmacy to get your drug, and so it gets a lot of that. So what I'm leading to is, I think in the longer term there will be increased, and there already has been, sort of almost bipartisan scrutiny on the cost of drugs, and so that will drive the need for us as an industry. And I put pharma and CROs in the same boat here, to be more effective and more efficient in the way we do clinical trials. We need to get drugs and devices to market more cost effectively than we're doing at the moment. It's the figures vary, but they're always in the billions for how much it costs to get a new drug to market. And as you know, the costs of those new drugs are getting some scrutiny. Aduhelm, aducanumab has been recently in the news on the Alzheimer's side of things, and the cell and gene therapies. These are very specific, very high tech sort of therapies, but they're very expensive. They're very effective in many cases, but also, so that means we have to continue to drive ourselves to be more efficient. And I believe the revolution, if you like, that you asked about is the technology that's now becoming available for us to do trials in a much more decentralized type manner. Traditionally, clinical trials have been run at physical, investigator sites. Patients have come into their doctor's offices or to the hospital and been seen on a regular basis. That's inherently very inefficient. It means patients have got to take a lot of time. It means monitors, and from my business, tend to go there physically to look at the data. I think going forward, as we are able to collect data in a more decentralized way, we're going to be able to monitor and manage and run those trials more efficiently. It's going to take a little bit of time, but I think the pandemic has shown that we can do this. And so that I think is the major kind of structural change, or I would call it structural opportunity. I would welcome it, because I do think we need to move in that direction. And I think ICON is certainly pushing in that direction as we put together our decentralized clinical trial approach, where we have our mobile health platform that's on the patient's phones. We have a home healthcare service with nurses who can go out to patients' houses and homes. We have a site network, because you're going to need to have some, connection with sites and principal investigators. So there's a number of characteristics, number of integrated components, if you like, of that clinical trial, which I believe we really have to be right on top of, in order to catch this wave that's running to the shore now, and to really address some of these longer term challenges around pricing and healthcare costs.
Yeah, well, you made some very good points, and one you said about the high cost of healthcare, and I do think that the drug industry, the biotech industry, is overly criticized. Now, they're guilty of some things. Obviously, they're guilty of some price increases that are not right, so forth. But the fact of the matter is, the cost of a hospital stay is far more an issue with regard to healthcare costs, and yet there's a lot less scrutiny, or MRIs. The other thing, which of course no one could do anything about, is essentially the U.S. patients are funding the global industry in terms of drugs, because the price of drugs outside the United States are much, much lower. So in a sense, we're actually subsidizing in the US. The US patients are subsidizing the use of drugs in many, many countries around the world. I don't know what you can do about that, but that's at least part of the problem. So the US companies have to get their profit from the US market, and it's a bad cycle, right? But I mean, the good news, though, is they're moving to actually cure diseases, whereas before a lot of the things were just prolonging life. and now we're getting cures. But as you said, one of the problems is some of these new technologies are very expensive. So you say, well, I can cure your disease, but it's going to cost 500,000, and for some people they say, well, it might as well not exist, right? Because I even with insurance, I can't afford that. So it's going. We're going to be in for a lot of turmoil, both good and bad, I guess, over the next 10 or 15 years. An icon specific question. So there are a bunch of large CROs, CDMOs, and now you're one of the largest. But they're all different, just like in many industries, they're very, like GM is different from Volvo and so forth. What's distinctive about Icon versus the other major players in whatever? And it could be managed sell, could be strategy, it could be product offerings, but what is different about Icon versus its major competitors?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things that are different about Icon. The first and very sort of overt thing is we're an Irish headquartered company. We're an Irish company, and we were started in Ireland. Our founder John Climax is still on our board. He started our organisation with Ronan Lamb back in 1990. 5 people in Dublin, and now we're 38,000. So it's been a real Irish growth story, and that's all of our sort of key competitors, large scale competitors, are US headquartered organizations. So we bring an Irishness, a Europeanness to a global industry, and I think that certainly differentiates us a little bit. We're also very much a scale player. As I said, we're able to we operate all around the world, and I think one of the differentiators for us is we're very focused in the clinical segment. People understand that when you develop a drug, you test it in animals in a preclinical model, and then you go into people in a clinical model, and then there's a commercialization and a selling. Our competitors, number of our competitors, in fact all of our big ones, work not just in the clinical space. We believe that being focused on the clinical area, the phase 1 through to phase 4, is important for us to deliver our best performance. We're very execution orientated, and so focusing in that area. We don't do the preclinical work, we don't do the commercial or the selling work, we don't get into diagnostic labs or anything like that. We have a central lab, but it's very much for our clinical trials. So that sort of focus, that relentless focus on execution and delivery, I think is one for us to differentiate upon. And then, as I said, our decentralized clinical trial offering, we're bringing together a number of integrating a number of the components of a decentralized trial. Now, this is somewhat aspirational as we move forward, but I do fundamentally believe that decentralized trials are the future, and we're positioning ourselves to be the most effective player in that space, and to capture a large chunk of that market going forward, because I believe it's so important that we do that really efficiently and effectively going forward. So, whether it be our home healthcare network, our site network, that we have the wearables expertise, on our phones. We bought the MAPI Trust, which is a group that has a number of questionnaires and patient reported outcome type vehicles that are important for patients to record data. So there's a number of components of that, and I think that's another sort of key differentiator for Icon.
By the way, I'm going to remind the audience that you can ask questions, and the way you do that is either in the chat box or the Q&A box. Just type in your questions, and both Steve and I will be able to see them. So, Steve, actually, you sort of anticipated my last question, which is looking forward, right? And well, you're moving backwards, but that's to turn your light on. But looking forward, all companies have to look out 5-10 years and say, all right, what do I have to change? What do I have to build or whatever in order to be successful as the world evolves and to gain share and be a very strong competitor? So you already mentioned, the decentralized clinical trials as one of the things that you're building. So obviously that's part of what you're doing to prepare yourself for the future. Are there other things that you're doing that, that are focused on how to be very, very successful 5 and 10 years out?
Peter, I think we're, as I sort of alluded to previously, we're in a somewhat, I think, golden age, or at least the potential to go into a sort of golden age of drug development over the next, decade or so. As you look at the science the incredible science that's being brought to drug research, and the mRNA technology that's really come to the fore during the COVID vaccine era, and how that could be applied to cancer vaccines and other therapeutic areas. The checkpoint inhibitors, which have somewhat revolutionized a number of indications within cancer and oncology, and a number of those drugs have really made significant progress in terms of outcomes on the oncology side. I think cell and gene therapy is another area that we really see great opportunity. So we have to be really embracing that sort of technology. We have to continue to develop our expertise to make sure that we understand those technologies, and we can help to bring those sorts of new drugs and devices, but particularly drugs in those areas, to market in a post-pandemic world. And I think that's the other area that we've seen that's been evolving. The acceptance, if you like, of clinical trials, the understanding of clinical trials in society. Traditionally 3 to 5% of people participate in a clinical trial. I'd be interested to know how many people on this call have ever participated in a clinical trial. I've never had the opportunity to do that, despite being in the industry. I think we have the potential to get that to more like 25 or 30%, whatever the number is, a significantly greater number of people participating, because they understand what the value of clinical trials is, to society through the whole pandemic, challenge and the vaccine study. So that, I think, gives us an opportunity. As I said, the regulators have been very open and amazing in the way they've embraced and allowed us to proceed with these new technologies on the decentralized front, the wearables, etc., the approval of new trials. So these are the sorts of areas that I see evolving, and we need to be prepared for. We need to be prepared to to run a clinical trial, 3 clinical trials for the current price of 2. That's the way I look at it. I push my organization to be more efficient. I think we need our sponsors to get more shots on goal, to bring more drugs to market, to allow the costs of that development to reduce, and for them to make a better return on their development spend ultimately.
Yeah. I don't see any questions, so I'm going to take the liberty of asking a question which wasn't on our list, but China is a real dilemma for many industries, right? There's kind of a love-hate relationship. The car companies, they worry about intellectual property, they worry about their ability to maintain control, so forth in China. On the other hand, they can't ignore the Chinese market because it's become such a huge market for automobiles. It's the largest market for automobiles in the world. And I think the pharmaceutical and related industries are dealing with the same love-hate thing, right? Because the Chinese healthcare industry is just booming, but also the development of Chinese pharmaceutical and biotech companies has been really astonishing over the last 5-10 years. So tell me, from your perspective, I guess you have your same list of love-hate things that you have to deal with relative to China, right? And how have you dealt with that?
Yeah, you characterize it very well, Peter. And the love-hate, the challenges that we have out there. There's how do I put this nicely? A somewhat inconsistent regulatory environment that we find very challenging as we try to run trials out there. And I venture to say that our sponsors have a similar sort of view as they market and sell, pharmaceuticals out there. And yet, as you say, there's an inherent indigent pharmaceutical industry out there that really, I think, over the next generation, certainly the next 5, 10, 20, is going to be a powerhouse of development and of research and of opportunity for companies like Icon, but also for pharma companies to connect up with as well. So you just can't afford to ignore a market that size. On the other hand, you have to be very careful in how you operate. They have sometimes a very different way of doing things, and you have to understand that, or try to understand that, and you have to respect it, and then you have to work with it. And these are some of the challenges, of course, that we as executives, we need to be able to, to understand and to deal with. And there's no point in throwing up your hands and saying, I can't do it, it's not enough. You just can't afford to ignore it. It is what it is. And so that's the attitude we're taking. We've had our challenges in China, but we recognize the value they bring. We recognize the opportunity they bring. We have well over 1,000 people now in China, in a number of cities out there, a number of offices. We've recently invested in a lab out there, our own lab, and we're making that investment because we fundamentally believe that, that's the right thing to do, because over the next, longer term, China is going to be an increasingly important part of the clinical development landscape, and we have to embrace it. We have to try to understand it better than we do now. And we have to work with the regulators, particularly on the sites and the pharmaceutical companies out there who have increasingly wanted to not just do work within China, but to do work, to move east and to do work in Europe and to do work in the United States. That's been more the exception than the rule up till now, but we're certainly seeing that happening more and more. And I believe that's going to only continue and grow over the next, say 5, 10, 20 years.
So Steve, we have a couple of questions. One is from Nisha Modi, who says, where is the biosimilar market concentrated? Is most of the innovation towards developing in big pharma or smaller CRO biotech companies?
Oh, I think in big pharma is the bigger companies are the ones that are sort of looking in the biosimilar market. We do a little bit of biosimilar work because you need to do the trials. It's not like a generic drug. Biosimilars are a little different. You need to run those trials, and a lot of the challenges are in the manufacturing of those drugs. So companies that have good competence in manufacturing are the ones that are really are in that space, in my view. And it's it's a market that's a very important one going forward.
Yeah. So another question comes from Julie Sui, I think it's CUI. Question for Steve. Looking back on your career journey within pharma and the CRO industry, what allowed you most to succeed from a personal career perspective in an often fast-changing landscape? And I'm sure the answer is your rugby experience, but you may have another answer, right?
Yeah, I don't think it was rugby, but rugby is a contact sport, and certainly in the CRO industry, I would argue there's an element of being in the advantages of being in a contact sport is there, because as I said, it's a very competitive industry. I could spend days answering that question, but I think it's a matter of for me, I'm an execution-orientated, action-orientated sort of person. I like to get things done. There's an element, you've got to be flexible in this business. We're in a service business. You can't be too sort of didactic about how you do things. We serve our customers and we need to help them. So flexibility, the willingness to take on new challenges. I've moved around the world, lived and worked on 4 different continents. So adaptability and the willingness to take on new challenges and sort of step into the unknown a little bit, take a risk, take a chance, I would say, some of the areas that I think you need to be able to succeed in this business.
So we pride ourselves on starting on time and ending on time, and we have 2 minutes left. So we have one last question here. It says, Steve, you hire and train workers for years, but the projects complete in months. How do you keep the utilization of scientists high?
Well, it's a matter of, again, back to that flexibility of being able to assign people to projects as they come in and as they start up. We bid on lots of projects. We win, that's sort of 40% of them. So you sort of work that into your resourcing, algorithms, and you ask people for their flexibility. Sometimes they're extremely busy. They're working on several projects. Other times they're not so busy. In the longer run, you look for it to sort of even out and for people to be engaged and to contribute and to be excited about working on different projects. I think one of the advantages of working for a CRO is you get to work on different drugs. You get to work in different areas and you get to contribute to a number of different drugs. We've contributed to something like 90% of the top 20 selling drugs in the world. We've made a contribution to, and our people have made a contribution to, and so that's an area that I think is really excites people about working in our business, and that our employees are the most flexible and skillful, I think, in the industry, and I'm grateful every day for what they do.
Yeah. So with that, first of all, I want to thank you, Steve, for agreeing to be interviewed in this fireside chat. I have to tell you, in this 1 hour, we really covered some really important topics about how the industry is changing, what is the evolution has been, but also your own career and and how your own company is adjusting and thriving in this changing industry. And I also want to thank all of you in the audience for attending. I hope you found today's Fireside Chat to be helpful and useful. And we look forward to seeing all of you at our next couple of webcasts. And we're also looking forward to the time when we all can be back in person at the L Club. But I suspect there'll still always be some virtual aspect, given how the world has changed. But we look forward to being able to have some kind of hybrid events at some point in the future. So thank you very much, and thank you, Steve. And it's while we were on this phone that it went from light outside where we could see Ireland to dark. So we know it's now evening in Ireland, and we wish you the very best.
Time for a Guinness, Peter, I think is what you'd say, right?
Absolutely. It's good for you, right?
Good for you. Exactly. Thanks again, Peter. Appreciate it, and enjoyed the opportunity.
Great.